Welcome everyone to our inaugural seminar for the new Global Childhoods Research Hub. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here tonight, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of university land. I recognize and respect the elders, past, present, and emerging. I respect their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place that we live and work in. I acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. On May the 2nd, the Research Committee in NGSC approved the formation of a new research hub called Global Childhoods. The focus of Global Childhoods is on the lives and experiences of children up to age 18 years of age across the world. Global Childhoods at NGSC will position children's lives, worldviews, and futures at its core. It will connect childhood research and teaching in a clear and cohesive manner, bringing together projects from leading academics, early career researchers, research fellows, and doctoral students around interdisciplinary themes and research problems, including those related to equity, social justice and disadvantage, climate change and sustainability, contemporary learning ecologies, multimodal lives, education systems, and children as activists. This unique research hub will contribute to and strengthen the internationalization of research activity in MGSC and across the university. We will collaborate with new and well-established global partners that have similar aims and scope and act as a conduit to stimulate new cutting-edge research projects. To that end, we have a number of researchers from across the University of Melbourne as members, and these include Professor John Tobin in the School of Law, who has a particular interest in children's rights, Associate Professor Sana Nakata, who thinks politically about childhood and ways that improve the capacity of adult decision makers to act in their interests, Professor Leah Rupana from the Future of Work Lab. Her research investigates gender and its intersection to inequalities, technologies, and policies. And Associate Professor Jane Dyson from the Faculty of Arts, whose ethnographic research in the Indian Himalayas examines gender, work, and social transformations. Professor Nicola Phillips, our provost, whose expertise is in the field of international political economies and international development. And across the faculty, we have members like Kate Coleman and Melina Mallas in the arts, Licho Lopez in social transformations, and Martina Tassone and Anne-Marie O'Brien in literacy. So we will connect people and research problems to facilitate, mentor, and activate dialogue and debate, and create interdisciplinary partnerships to set up innovative and forward-thinking research projects and publications. To that end, we will be able to use and build on our existing interdisciplinary research networks, as well as our established research publication outlets such as the Global Studies of Childhood Journal published by SAGE and the SAGE Handbook entitled Global Childhoods, and two research series with Springer, Global Childhoods in the Asia Pacific, which builds on our current ARC project based in the global cities of Melbourne, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And the second, edited by Sonia, Marek Tessar, and Karen Malone, and entitled Children, Post-Humanist Perspectives and Materialist Theories. Childhoods are not equal within nations and globally. The hub will disrupt silo discourses that break up childhood into age categories so we can better understand the interconnections and disconnections, I should say, of multiple childhood experiences in their context. As the world continues to change through technologies, natural and man-made events or disasters, and mobilities, the hub will respond to the need for new structure and ways of theorizing childhoods and children's capabilities as we engage in alternative research and policy narratives to create new possibilities. So tonight we get to our first inaugural seminar, and we're going to hand over to our leader of the series, Sonia Arndt, and look forward to the opportunity to start this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for that. Looking around the corner here at you. Thank you for that introduction. And for the welcome. And I too want to welcome everybody who's here in the room, and also welcome those of you who are joining us from overseas, from other places in Australia, and indeed who haven't braved the Melbourne weather, who are here in Melbourne as well. I also too want to introduce and to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Willam people of the Kulin Nation, which is where the image has come from on our banners and on our first slide that was up here of the Mary Mary Creek. And I want to acknowledge that this first global seminar is taking place in Reconciliation Week, and that actually is very relevant, I think, to the topics that we're going to be talking about. It's also International Children's Day today. So June the 1st, perfect day for us to be talking about global childhoods. So thank you for joining us on this day. A couple of really quick practicalities. If you're here in the room and you need to exit very quickly, the exit is over here. Toilets also are over here. And the COVID notice, which is quite lengthy, that the University of Melbourne requires us to insert, appeared in your email. So if you go away from today feeling like you might need to read that, please use that to have a read through. So it's most of all tonight my great honour to welcome Nerita Waight, who's the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Nerita, hi. And to welcome Hamm, who is an advisor and
lots of things.
Advisor to community, non-profit, government organisations on matters pertaining to Aboriginal children and young people in Australia, amongst lots of things we decided when we were talking the other day. So the format of this seminar is going to be that, first of all, Nerita and Ian are going to talk a little bit about the work that they do, and then they're going to interact with each other on the provocations that are, first of all, what are the issues that they see confronting Indigenous children and youth in Australia, in what ways their work might have to do with or respond to those issues, and how they see the correlations between those issues and their work with the Indigenous and young people and young children who are overseas in other countries and perhaps grappling with similar issues or perhaps having different issues, and how we can work together with many of our colleagues in other countries as well. So we do see a lot of things that we can learn from you both tonight. And I have to say, I'm really very much looking forward to hearing from you. And I'm really honoured that you're here. I have to just reiterate that too. At the end of the talk, there will be some time for questions. So if you're here in the room, then obviously we can take those from the floor. If you're on Zoom, then please type them into the Q&A, and Nick over here will be, who you can't see because he's behind the camera, but Nick is going to read out the questions that get typed into the Q&A. So we'll try and balance them both. Nerita and Ian, fantastic to have you both here. I'm not going to take up any more of your time.
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri land tonight, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I think particularly this week, acknowledging that is important, not just to do it because I'm Aboriginal, but because it's Reconciliation Week. And I think it's important that everybody takes the time to think about where they are, how they're connected to place, and how place connects to them. So by acknowledging we're on Wurundjeri land, it's about thinking, where do I fit into this place here? Where do I fit into the community I live? And excuse me, particularly, I guess as an Aboriginal person, this is where it comes in with children too, is that connection in this third decade of the 20th century is probably a big issue for us. So I guess in terms of what I do and how that connects to children and some of the challenges for children, but I'll deal with the connection stuff first. So I'm actually a non-executive director these days, and I sit on a whole range of boards. But the ones that really, for me, I guess, make me think about the future and its connection to future generations is the boards I'm on that are around particularly Aboriginal community activity. So like the Koori Heritage Trust, which is here in Melbourne, which is an arts and culture trust. Now, its role is to, a lot of people, when you say the Koori Heritage Trust, they automatically think of the past. They think of our role is to collect old objects, which it was when the trust was started in the mid-1980s. But that's evolved over time now. So the role of the trust now is to think about what can we do to support Aboriginal communities through what honestly is a very rapid pace of change for Aboriginal Victorians at the moment. So when I think of the trust and being on the board of that, that's at the forefront of our mind, is how do we support Aboriginal communities change? Aboriginal Housing Victoria, I'm on the board of that. We think about with that, it's not just giving housing to people, but it's particularly thinking about how is the Aboriginal community changing and what sort of housing do they need for the future? It kind of goes back to younger people again, is what housing do they need now as opposed to what housing a lot of people think Aboriginal people need? And that's really changed over the life of Aboriginal Housing Victoria. When AHV was started in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, most Aboriginal families were quite large, and some were really large. So we used to get properties that had like 5, 6 bedrooms. They were the bulk of our 3, 4, 5, 6 bedroom housing. They were the bulk of what we had. But we're finding now the biggest in demand housing we have is for older people who want to scale down, but young people who are thinking they'll have 1, maybe 2 kids. In my mother's case, she was one of 14. In my own case, I'm one of 8. In 2 families, it's not going to go into it now, it's complicated. But, you get the gist of it. A lot of people my age belong to bigger families. That's shifting. So what does that mean for younger Aboriginal people? And I guess the last one I want to talk about or mention is I'm chairman of the board of the First Nations Foundation. And we think about, and our role, it originally started, the First Nations Foundation, about helping people who are on very small incomes or on the pension and so forth, budget on really tight money, which was, if you're on the pension, that's still really tight. But we evolved that over time because when you've got this huge population bubble of Aboriginal people who are the Aboriginal population is predominantly young, 50 in the state of Victoria, 50% of the Aboriginal population is under the age of 20. Around 60, I used to know this number off the top of my head, 57 point something percent is under the age of 25. So we have the huge bubble of young people. And when you get into children under 18 and you get into ones under 10, that bubble just gets bigger the whole time. The percentages get bigger. So with First Nations Foundation, we went from helping people budget on a really rubbish income, and we still do that, but helping young people think about how do they make the most of their money? How do young Aboriginal people see themselves, and how can they enter the world of economic prosperity? And how can they make the most of the money they're earning as they increasingly go into the economy? One of the things which all of those 3 organisations, for example, have to contemplate and get their head around is how do they adapt to fit the world of particularly Aboriginal children and Aboriginal young people, and not bend them into the world where we're comfortable back in the days when we were established. So that's kind of what I do is that's how I interact with particularly younger Aboriginal people. Nerita.
Certainly, Uncle Ian probably deals with the contrasts in our community. So those who are doing very well versus those who aren't. I very much deal with those who aren't. So I run the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, which is coming up to 50 years next year. And we provide essential legal services to Aboriginal communities. So that's criminal legal service delivery, civil and family. And we also have a very special program called Bilit Nalu, which is an Aboriginal children's legal service and comes from a very different framework than when we originally set up, in that the service design is basically done by children and informed by youth, and has had great outcomes because of that. When I look at my everyday client base, it is unfortunately a lot of the time extraordinarily young. But then when we look at cohorts above 35 into Uncle Ian's age bracket, you're talking about people who have been institutionalized for basically their whole life. All they've ever known is institutionalized care. And so it's really hard to break that cycle where in our younger cohort, we have more of a chance to break that cycle. So I'm very lucky to be able to do that work, and also lucky to be able to do some advisory work when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the reform of public intoxication, and also when it comes to corrective services. So all very close to dear to my heart. And I also raised 2 children, so I feel very close to the childhood space in that sense. And I don't think I'm that far off my own.
And from where I sit, she's absolutely right. But I think it does throw up, Nerita points out, it does show up the contrast for Indigenous children and the spectrum of what does it mean to be Aboriginal in the third decade and beyond of the 21st century. I think for young people in particular and children, this is it's a difficult space to contemplate. Like when I was young, and that's back in the not quite the middle part of the 20th century, but you know,
The 70s, everyone.
the 70s. How do you call that? About the 3/4 pace? Anyway, for many of you who are studying at university for the first time, that's back in your parents' time, which just makes me feel really old talking about this. But anyway, what did it mean if you were born Aboriginal, if you're a young Aboriginal in the 1970s? It meant a range of things, but it also meant a limit of things as well. The expectation of you wasn't terribly high. Your opportunity wasn't great. You were effectively, I guess, also conscious that being Aboriginal was as much a political statement as anything else. One of the things I remember is from where I was, but seeing a lot of Aboriginal political activity, people doing things, and not just singular things in a place, say Canberra, but things happening in Melbourne and things happening in Shepparton, which is the ancestral homelands of myself and Nerita. Things happening in Shep at the local level. But it was a different time. One of the things I think we have to be conscious of, or I'm conscious of as an older person, and I think for anybody who interacts with children and who works with them has to be conscious of, is that as much as you're invested in them, you can't get them to live your life. You can't make them fit into the world that's comfortable for you. Your job, if you like, is to give them the opportunity to discover where they're going. That's something I guess that I'm terribly conscious of, but I'd be particularly interested in, Nerita, your take on that. As somebody who is a generation younger than me, who grew up in, again, when Aboriginal affairs or the Aboriginal community was changing and evolving, and what that means for you as a parent.
And was somewhat parented by you. I have some feedback there. Certainly, I think that there were those different experiences from when you were a child. And I mean, even you've got contrasting childhood experiences to that of my mum, your older sister. And certainly her experiences were very different than I had. And I think that definitely influences the way that she parented and definitely the way that she had her outlook. But I also think that the things that have always woven through our generations are principles around culture, around connection, around respect, and around always wanting to do better. That sense, I think self-determination has been woven in us for generations, going back probably to formation. When I look at my children, they certainly, again, have a different experience to me. I was brought up by a single parent. They are not. They are very fortunate. They don't struggle week to week. My mum did. So I think that certainly that privilege is increasing. And then I contrast their experiences with children that I see through the course of what I do. And what I see is that whilst we have, we need to acknowledge those who are doing well and celebrate that and find ways to encourage that. But there are those who continue to suffer in silence and be hidden away because that disadvantage has been institutionalized and The system has created it in a way that their parents were locked up, they were locked up, their children are heading in that direction unless there is suitable intervention. And the things that work best for us are probably the same things that worked well for your sister, worked for you, which was those community solutions and those community get-togethers. I was really lucky that I grew up around Nana Claire, and certainly a formidable woman there, and had some really great principles. And the way that I govern and the way that I tend to have an outlook on life, I think is very much originated from her approach. And yours to some extent, because you've been a parental figure who I think has an ability to step away and think, where I think my generation particularly maybe idolizes what happened in the 70s and 80s and would like to go back to that social activism, and we just haven't yet found that balance. And I hope that's what Matteo and Luca can achieve.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right there, Nerita. I think that thing of perhaps people of younger generations having an idealistic view of what the past was like, it's always any generation and any culture will look back on a golden age or supposed golden age. I believe 1V Putin is doing the same thing at the moment. But when you look back at the past, you can put on the rose-coloured glasses and think it was great, and think the protest movement of the 70s, and we were such a great community and stuff. We had our pitfalls and our ups and downs, our children not having opportunity. I worry sometimes today that some of our children and younger people think the best way to express their Aboriginality is to do what people did in my generation again. But my generation didn't fight for our children to live our lives the way we lived them. We want them to live other lives. So I think there's that bit that we struggle with. And there's also, there is now, if you like, a spreading out of the Aboriginal community too. And by that I mean, we're becoming more empowered economically, more empowered politically. For goodness sakes, look at how many blackfellas are in the Australian Parliament after the last election. And there is one good thing. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't agree with me on this, but they're across pretty well the main spectrum of Australian politics, you know. So we don't have any socialists, and we've got nobody in the United Australia Party and One Nation Party. I can live with that. But we've got Green to the Country National Party in the Northern Territory, which is, you know, the coalition up there. And we've got people spread across that, and Labor and Liberal in the middle. That is fantastic. That is great. But the reflection I get off that is when I think about where we are socially and economically as a community, we have, as you deal with, Nerita, people still stuck in poverty, people who from a young age know no other life than a deep and almost destructive interaction with the justice system or the legal system, the child protection system, right through to, well, my two children who have grown up well off economically, and therefore socially have avoided a lot of the issues that others have not had the opportunity to deal with. And so it makes me think that the spectrum of Aboriginality for young people is becoming more diverse, and young people are asking a question. So where do I fit into that spectrum? Where do I fit in as being Aboriginal across that? And for anybody working in the education space, that's really something deep to contemplate. What can I do in the education system to support young Aboriginal people across that spectrum of where they might fit into the definition of being Aboriginal?
But and part of that is also giving them opportunity to have a voice.
Yes.
Too often, I think we ignore children's capacity to form views and to provide valuable feedback. I mean, my oldest child is 4, and let me tell you, he has opinions, and he's not afraid to share them, whether it be about beetroot or whether it be about what he feels that I should be doing when it comes to Aboriginal children. So it's really, and look, I can't talk, I was the same. You reap what you sow. But certainly what I would like to see is, people engaged in education, people engaged in politics, people engaged in economics even, actually providing that pathway for children to have a voice and have a say in how resources are spent in relation to them. And this is not something that we have engaged in as a society in terms of a discussion. Yet the CRC, which contemplates this, actually was published the same year as the Ricky Dick report, which was over 30 years ago. And much like Ricky Dick, has sat there, which is horrifying and really unfortunate. And I think harks back to the fact that we pigeonhole people. We decide that we will do reviews and then they sit there because it's too hard. I think as a society, we have moved on. We have greater capacity and greater understanding and empathy, and we can tackle these big social issues as long as we work together. And it starts from the way that you educate people. It starts from the way that you have discussions here in this university, from my perspective.
And so just for those who don't know, Ricky Dick is the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and CRC is?
The Convention of the Rights of the Child, which I hope you would all know. And another important treaty is UNDRIP, which really talks about the rights of Indigenous peoples and really talks to how you can economically empower communities so that we can address the economic disparity that I see day to day, as does Uncle Ian.
And one of the things, actually, when you talk about pigeonholing, that's a really interesting concept, because children often go to where they think they have to for everyone around them. And particularly Aboriginal kids can do that. And so there's some work I was involved with the Richmond Football Club here in Melbourne, which many of you won't know, but it's a big sporting club and so forth. Champions, they're my club. But anyway, beside that, but Richmond Football Club got involved with wanting to do Aboriginal programs. And what they focused on was, if you like, they went where every other football club went in the period of 2000 to 2010. That is, they went to outback and remote Australia, and they tried to connect, and I say tried to connect, with remote communities, and were only moderately successful at it, as were a lot of the other AFL clubs. And so when Richmond came and asked the Victorian government for some assistance, the then minister said, why am I going to pay you money to go up to the Northern Territory? Check the sign on the door. I'm the Victorian government Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, not the Northern Territory one. So if you're asking us for assistance, focus on Victoria. So the first thing you like was to shift away from almost the romantic notion, and I put that in inverted commas, or the stereotypical notion that all Aboriginal people are up north and all people with disadvantage need our help and they're only in one place, to focus it back on Victoria. And the second thing was, particularly around these programs involving children, was to not think of just the deeply disadvantaged, because that's what has happened a lot of the time. Is Aboriginal people are broken up, particularly young people, are broken up into two categories. Those who excel, have very talented and will achieve great things, and those who are deeply disadvantaged. Now, those two groups exist, and of course we should support them. But it's the 90% in the middle who are often the ones who miss out, often the ones that people don't think about. So Richmond Footy Club decided to focus on those in Victoria. There was a gap which nobody else had looked at before, ordinary Aboriginal kids. And they phrased it around, you don't have to fit into what we're doing, we'll build something around you. The only thing we ask of you is go to school and try your hardest. And that's all you've got to do. And so Richmond's been running this program now for over 10 years and it works really well. So well, I sent our own son on it, and our daughter would have gone on it except for COVID, and she's spewing about it. She lets her brother know too. But it's one of those programs which focuses on the ordinary kids who are just the ones in the middle. And what it's helped them do is break out of the stereotype of what they think they should be to satisfy other people. In the education space, that really matters when it comes to Aboriginal kids. Don't build your program around what you think I am. Ask me what I am. Let me tell you what I am, and build your program around me to suit that. And that I think will help, well, not will help, but that will bring out the best in Indigenous children or Aboriginal children anywhere. And particularly in where we live, here in suburban Melbourne, in urban Melbourne and in urban cities, which is where the bulk of Aboriginal people live in Australia anyway.
But what you're talking about really is voice being part of, being a tool in the toolbox of early prevention. Yeah. Because often those in that field can go either way. They can go into your disadvantaged group, or they can go into the other group doing really well. But what often happens is, particularly in government investment, as well as I think in any service provision, is that often enough you're just focused on the crisis and you forget to think ahead. And what we've certainly tried to do and influence is thinking about using voice as a way to engage in early prevention and diversion in some respects. So I would again urge you all to do what Uncle Ian has outlined, because I think it can be really beneficial.
Yeah, and asking people, it's surprising what people come up with when you ask them what they think. So I used to work in government before I do what I do now. I was in government and was the head of Aboriginal Affairs in Victorian government. And as Nerita said, government was often constructed around disadvantage, was around the notion that all Aboriginal people were severely disadvantaged, which we're not. We have a disproportionately larger amount of it than other communities, but we're not all in that space. Yet the very definition of Aboriginal used by government was that all blackfellas are like this, which kind of meant if you weren't like that, then where do I fit in? Don't I fit into how people view blackfellas? Which actually was a complete waste of talent and time. And it was premised on the thing, a good day was when things don't get worse. How is that a good day that things don't get worse? So one of the things we did when I was at Aboriginal Affairs, we did this radical thing of not basing stuff on just on data, because data will only tell you the answer to the questions you asked. We did this thing of just asking ordinary Aboriginal people what was important to them. And the result we got was something that had never turned up in any of the data. But we used that as the basis for reforming Aboriginal affairs in this state. And it was predominantly about this question of how do we support our children and help them build on their strengths in the 21st century as being Aboriginal, and how do we connect to the wider population? It wasn't about, the biggest thing for the Aboriginal community wasn't about poor health status, it wasn't about justice, it wasn't about, give me another thing, education. The biggest thing was ensuring that our children have a confident understanding of themselves and using that as the strengths-based approach for going forward. That's what happens when you ask people.
But I think that was probably an ideal period in the Victorian government's history, not just because of you. but prior to that, there'd been that appetite for Aboriginal people's trauma, Aboriginal people's stories and disadvantage. We're only as good as the next trauma, basically.
Yeah.
And then that kind of set up a change in government. And you certainly saw that in investment decisions, in strategies that were laid out, and some of the frameworks on our existence. But now we have certainly moved backwards in relation to seeing Aboriginal people pigeonholed, and that appetite for our trauma, that appetite for our sorry business, that appetite that we are no good other than the next media story. And I think what we need to move back is that period. But the only way to do that is if we as a civil society actually start to make that move first, because government is often an echo chamber in of itself, and isn't so good at stepping away and seeing the bigger picture. But if we all start doing it, then they'll naturally replicate us, because that's how they get elected every year.
Yeah, and it actually picks up something you said, Nerita, about government echo chambering to itself. One of the things that has really, if you like, helped with progression we have made is Aboriginal people leading it. So it's one of the things I've really noticed is since from the year 2000 to where we are now, I look at that. One of the things that used to really annoy me, it annoys me much less now, but it still annoys me a bit, is Aboriginal people looking to government for the answers, waiting for government to come up with a policy, waiting for government to say something and then reacting to it, which puts you in a terribly disempowering position. Instead, I hope I've helped contribute to us taking a much greater lead role in where we want to go, about us deciding where we want to go, and here, government, here's where you fit into that, or where you don't fit into that, because not everything about us should revolve around government. We should be actually feel more empowered and more in control ourselves. I think we've moved the dial, but as Nerita said, I think the dial's come back a bit, but now we're back to where it was. But it's kind of that 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing. That's always going to happen. And that's the same with the kids too. giving our children that sense of empowerment that they can help, they can determine where they're going and what they're doing. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think that that's the frame that I would want to think about. How we give our, well, in a generation from now, how your little boys just have a different view of being Aboriginal to what I had when I was young.
And I think in order to get to sort of that bright future that you envision, we do need to remove those systemic barriers. You know, a lot of our systems are set up to treat children in a certain manner. I mean, at the moment, a 10-year-old is criminally responsible, yet health experts, experts in your own field of education are very clear that that's not right. That doesn't accord with their capacity. It doesn't actually accord with their abilities. But yet here we are, where with a 10-year-old who has a problem, we criminalise them, we put them in a youth prison, and then we expect the outcome to be good. Rather than engaging in early prevention and diversion, rather than trying to make sure that we let them influence where their own path is. And that's certainly something that whether a child is in youth justice, whether they're in child protection, or whether they're a 4-year-old at a house in Woolwich, which they've probably trashed by now, I want them to be able to self-determine their path. I want to be a tool in their toolbox. I do not want to dictate what their path is.
No, sorry, can I jump
Yes,
in?
yeah.
In terms of your work then,
Yes.
how do you work with young children, young youth then, 10 and above year olds, who you say need to be given a voice? How do we work with that?
So certainly we actually do work with children younger than 10 because children younger than that who are engaged in the family division of the children's court can be given an independent children's lawyer, or if they're engaged in a family court matter as well. You have to realise that you have to meet the child where they're at. So that includes talking to the child, getting to know them, making an assessment as to their capacity, and then utilising that assessment to then work out next steps. You know, some children are a very young 8, some are a very old 8, depending upon their experiences. So that older 8-year-old will have an ability to determine what they think are the next steps in their best interest and what works for them. And it's our job then to help them articulate that and to advocate for that. That very young 8-year-old who maybe doesn't have that ability, it's about getting to know the child, understanding what their needs are, and then trying to advocate for those. So it's always meeting the child where they're at, which, you know, certainly I see, because my children, I attend an Aboriginal childcare agency in kindergarten. They have a really good early childhood program where they actually meet the children where they're at. Mateo had some speech difficulties and they picked it up early and they worked with him to address those in what he was interested in, which was dinosaurs at the time. Sadly, is now snakes and lizards and yabbies. And that was really helpful in accelerating his ability to resolve those issues. You know, and they also work with children who are in care, whether it be child protection or whether it be in youth justice. And again, they meet the child where they are and provide those services that work for them. And as a community, we've always done it. So Uncle Ian's grandmother, my great grandmother, was really influential in Shepparton and used to, as a way to make sure that police wouldn't pick up Aboriginal people, would hide them in her house. And she would give them a feed, give them a shower and a change of clothes. And then once it was safe, would set them off. You know, she would meet them there. And when they were ready for those deeper services to help, she would rally community around and do that. And then that's how Rumballara was formed, out of that idea. And was the first regional town to receive housing for young Aboriginal mums, because she saw the need for them to be safe and to provide a home base so the children could stay in their family and grow up strong in community. And I think that's what we try to do. Sure, I think we all have different perceptions of Aboriginality, and I think we always will. I think every generation what Aboriginal means to them will be different. And I'm sure you see this in other countries who have Indigenous and First Nations communities.
Yeah, I was going to ask in what ways you see that as something that maybe people in other countries might focus on too, but the meeting the child where they're at is something that we talk about in a lot of different countries and with the work that a lot of us do with young children.
And attacking them from that, not attacking them, but looking at them from that strengths-based approach, because we as a community have suffered from always being looked at as in the deficit. And what Uncle Ian tried to do when he was in government and serving his time was trying to kind of flip that script and like, let's look at it from strengths-based approach and let's not rely on government. Let's try and work out what we can do with ourselves or what we can do outside of that space. Because government investment will only last so long, and we need a solution for what that looks like now, not later.
Yeah. Do you think that the new government that we just had announced, you know, who's taking what roles last night, might take us another step forward again from the couple of steps back that you said that we've gone? Or
I think they'll progress where we've gone. So I think one of the things government will not struggle with, but certainly this government or the new government has said it wants to progress a couple of big things on the agenda, which is the constitutional reform around recognition and particularly a voice to Parliament. I think the acceleration of this stuff is going to happen. We're certainly going forward. Actually, the biggest thing for me out of the election, and particularly out of the swearing in of the ministry today, was Linda Burney being appointed. Now, a lot of people have focused on her being the first Indigenous woman to be minister. I've actually focused on her being the second Indigenous person to be minister, because that's now, it's removed the novelty factor of the first one. It's now we've got two Indigenous ministers, one consecutive after the other. It kind of almost sets the pattern that any other minister who follows must necessarily be Indigenous if they're going to be the Minister for Indigenous Australians. That is a huge shift, but it automatically changes the very notion of the agenda going forward, because the person who's making the decisions or leading government is one of us, and that changes everything. It was interesting to note that Malarndirri Malarndirri, I can never say her last name, but Malarndirri from the Northern Territory, a senator, Aboriginal woman, she was also sworn in as an assistant minister focusing on Aboriginal health. Now, if I can read politics. If she's not the backup minister, I don't know what is. Certainly Pat Dotson being special envoy for constitutional reform, that's a great role for him. But it means if Linda Burney, for some reason, is no longer minister, they've got another minister who's Aboriginal ready to back her up. That's the big shift. And any minister after her is going to subsequently have to be Aboriginal as well. I think that's put all political parties on notice that you're going to have another Aboriginal person in Parliament. But I also think the agenda will get really much more tipped towards let's build on what's good about being Aboriginal, as opposed to let's focus on what's not good about being Aboriginal. Shifting from that deficit to a strengths-based approach. Instead of telling Aboriginal people what their issues are, letting Aboriginal people decide what we want to focus on and let that lead the agenda. We don't take our eyes off the bad things that we need to focus on, because you don't leave anyone behind. But I certainly think shifting it to that strengths-based approach is if you move everybody up, then even those who are severely disadvantaged, you'll drag some of those people up too. So what's left you can really focus on and eventually help them up as well.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the things that you've mentioned tonight, the high expectations happen through those kinds of shifting up, pulling up, and also that notion of if you do what's good for Aboriginal people, then it's going to be good for everybody else as well. right?
It-
For the society in general.
Exactly. It only enriches our nation.
Yeah.
It only enriches who we are as a people and adds to our sum total. Of course, it's going to be a good thing. Yeah.
But I also think sometimes we just do service delivery better. I mean, look at
We
the
do.
COVID response
Yes.
for Aboriginal communities versus mainstream. So no doubt we were way more effective.
Yeah.
And I also, this might surprise Uncle Ian, but I really liked the number of independents now that we have in play, because I think it just provides a more representative parliament. And I think even we look at just the First Nations representatives, like Uncle Ian said, they're all from different parties, but they have some commonalities, but they also have very different experiences in different age groups. Like Linda Burney's in a different age category than say Lydia Thorpe, who's in the Greens.
Yep.
And they have these, and then you've got Joanna Stewart. There's much more. And then you've got Pat Dodson, who's very much an Aboriginal elder and kind of a statesman, I think, within the Labor
Yeah.
Party. So all of these different viewpoints just show that Aboriginal people aren't all the same and will enrich the debate, which is fantastic.
Which is really necessary for Aboriginal affairs too, because that's also demonstrating we are a diverse population. Jana comes from Melbourne, Pat Dotson's from the Kimberley, Nalandieri's from Darwin, Linda's from Sydney. And there is the age spectrum too. Jana's just over 30 and expecting a second child. Pat's an elder statesman, not only of just the Aboriginal community, but of Australia as a whole. Everybody, everybody knows who Pat Dodson is and respects his work. So I think that also helps children see, I do have a place to fit in. We're not all the same. And it also says, I can be a member of parliament. I mean, when I was a kid, there was no way. There was one Aboriginal person who was a member of parliament, Neville Bonner, and he came and went. And I often wondered, will I ever see another black fella in parliament? And now, tripping over him in the corridors, it's great. I wouldn't that much, but that's really important. Yeah, message to children. That thing, if you can't be what you can't see, well, now you can see it.
Yep.
Now you can see that there are people in power. Now you can see that there are those who are making decisions. In my own case, now you can see an Aboriginal person who's the senior public servant in Aboriginal affairs. Breakthrough moment.
Yeah, it's certainly been, I think, an evolution. If you look at the generations of our family, it tells a perfect tale of opportunity and progress. And definitely probably had more perceived limits than I did. I didn't ever feel limited. Again, probably virtue of personality versus circumstance. And my own child doesn't feel limited. I mean, at the moment, he wants to be Barack Obama, President of the United States, because he saw a documentary and decided, hey, that looks fun. I want those Secret Service agents.
Barack Obama.
So I think that being what you can see is really powerful. Certainly has been for me. I mean, I've always idealized the people in my family and what they've achieved, which has been fantastic. But I also just idolized, really old school people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who's not Aboriginal, but certainly did a lot of impressive things in human rights and is finally getting the attention she deserves on Apple TV. And I also loved Martin Luther King, and I can tell you every speech he ever wrote. Martin certainly inspired a lot of my own writing in some ways, and Malcolm X, not a surprise to anybody, but I love him. And then also female writers like Larissa Burnett, like that's who I wanted to be when I was in law school. I was like, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. And segued to CEO of Aboriginal Legal Service. Don't tell me that happened. It is what it is.
That's pretty cool, eh? Actually, one of the things I have seen over my lifetime really change is the rise of Aboriginal culture as a key part of our identity, or reattachment to our roots. Now, when I grew up, there was no such thing as Aboriginal land rights. They only existed in a few remote communities up north who were so remote or had nothing of value or perceived value to the rest of Australia that the blackfellas were allowed to have their country anyway. And your community or identity was a contemporary one, but it was always a fluid contemporary one, as in Royal Commission of Deaths in Custody was because of our relationship with the justice system, or bad Aboriginal health, or our fight for just to be recognised as people a la 1967. And then the most significant single thing, I think, well, one of the most significant single things of the 20th century for Australia, certainly I think, is equal to the 67 referendum.
Mm.
Eddie Mabo won his case before the High Court. That single act of him of saying these, and it's only his claim on Mara Island would only be about half as big as this theatre. So what would that be? Not even 60 square yards. It's tiny, but it was his patch of terra firma that had been handed down to him from the beginning of time. And he went to the High Court of Australia, and the High Court of Australia recognised it. And it basically said, these people in these circumstances have not been disconnected, and it established land rights, or gave it effect in the law, in the common law. And what that did was start a whole reimagining of Aboriginal people, particularly by Aboriginal people, about our relationship and our place, our relationship with our country and our place in the wider Australian society. We are not the disconnected people. We're as deeply connected as we have always been.
Mm.
That plays itself out differently around the country. But what you saw, particularly in South East Australia, where European colonisation had its worst effects, is that Aboriginal people saying, no, we have continued these unbroken roots, and we're now going to build on those.
Mm.
So now you see Aboriginal kids not only celebrating their culture, their traditional identity, people who are Yorta, people who are Wurundjeri, people who show that expression of how they interpret their particular Aboriginal culture, their tribal Aboriginal culture, and the strength that that gives them, and how it builds on the heroes of the past, and that they see themselves as an unbroken line. So younger Aboriginal people see themselves these days as Aboriginal being, for the most part, but not always, but for the most part, that's an advantage. It's not a disadvantage.
But see, you see Mabo just in the context of traditional identity, but I also see it in the context of it was the first time the Aboriginal community really recognised law as a tool of empowerment versus oppression, and that is what is always missed by everybody's, and rightfully so, ideal version of Mabo, is that it's not just about native title. It really kind of moved then from law becoming a tool for us. So then in WIC, people, which is also a really good judgment to read. But then also when we even look now, we wouldn't be able to go to the coroner's court with such conviction and belief in being able to use the law as a tool if that decision hadn't had it. People like Tanya Day, Veronica Nelson, they wouldn't have those opportunities. The age pension case that we're running right now wouldn't be an opportunity. The fact that we're able to keep children out of Barwon prison, which again, illogical, wouldn't have happened because we wouldn't have never known that we could use the law in a way to benefit us rather than what it is traditionally done, which is oppress us. I mean, my grandmother died not being counted.
Yeah. Which is a terrible thing, not counted in your own country. But you're absolutely right. That shift of, and it wasn't just a shockwave for the Aboriginal people to say, hey, shit, we matter. There was a lot of non-Aboriginal people who went, what, they matter? Isn't the law supposed to tell them that they don't matter? And then the Anthony Mason court turned around and said, no, they really matter, like a lot. They own this joint. We need to come to some form of agreement around that. So you're right, that was the fundamental shift.
And it's been so beneficial because it's meant decisions like Bug Me. It has meant reforms in sentencing because courts felt empowered to use the law to achieve justice for Aboriginal people and communities. I idolise Mabo for various reasons, but my prime reason is that it is that hallmark of revolution of the law, which as a lawyer is important to me.
Which puts our place of we're not given things because they're a gift to us. We can take things because it's our right. That particularly for our kids, if there's one thing I see for my children, Jasper and Isabel, is that they're not afraid to exercise their rights. when I was growing up and when those that came before me, the idea that we had rights was an anathema. We had to fight to maintain what we had, let alone now people can extend what they don't have because it is their right of expectation to have it. That's
I
a
think
huge change.
this is where we differ, because you're talking about Isabel and Jasper, you know, having the ability to exercise their rights. Where for Teo and Iluka, I don't want that to be a problem. I want a system whereby they don't need to they don't feel the need to exercise their rights because their rights are respected.
It's an assumed thing from the beginning. It's not even a conscious thing.
It's normal practice, and they are seen as the norm rather than, you know, something to put up on a poster for an Aboriginal event or a NAIDOC week.
Yeah.
They're seen for all of the other benefits that they can provide as an individual person.
I'm going to take that opportunity to break in, and I don't really want to stop you because I'm fascinated by it, particularly the generational different ideas that you have around what is and isn't, that navigation of the, or kind of tensions between the expectations of you as parents, really, of what's happening. But I do want to open up to the floor for questions, and also to just check in with Nick. No questions online. Okay, so if there are any questions to people on Zoom and you want to type them into the Q&A, please do so. And if there are any questions from the floor, we have a few moments before we finish off that we can take those as well. Yeah.
So, are you right?
Yes, you need. It's on.
Sorry, I missed the part where you said that we have gone backwards. What specifically were you talking about? Backwards.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So look, I think what's happened over time. So if I look just at this century where we started, I'd say when I look at this century, it makes me feel really old. That does. I remember the last century. But when I think about, we've come a long way, but there are times where we go backwards, and actually Nerita's work is key to that. And there's been 2 high-profile cases now that shows, well, in my view, I think we've gone backwards. We didn't just stall, we've gone backwards. 2 recent deaths in custody of Aboriginal women who just should not have been in custody in the first place. Tanya Day and Veronica Nelson should not have been in custody. Now, they didn't happen 20, 30, 40 years ago. They happened 2 and 3 years ago, I think it was.
Yes, so only Tanya's 3 days, 3 years, sorry. Veronica's 2, but there's also Heather Calgarrett, who again died as a result of prison healthcare failures, and that was just last year, unfortunately, right towards the end.
So the justice system had actually been working hard at reforming itself. Its management of not only you can put I put the justice system in three simple parts: courts, cops, prisons. Right? The justice system had worked hard through an Aboriginal Justice Agreement to improve what it was doing, so that police handled their interaction with Aboriginal people better. The courts, particularly through the statement of the Koori Court, was being very progressive, and the custodial arrangements in the corrections system were much more progressive. And then, towards the end of the second decade, big steps backwards. 3 Aboriginal women die in custody because the coppers at a country station just arrested a woman because she was asleep on a train. She dies that night in custody because they didn't pay enough attention to what they were supposed to do. A woman is pulled over for suspected shoplifting and somehow winds up in the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre in less than 24 hours. And the third one is in prison in the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre again.
Yep, same unit, yeah.
Same year. And through the corrections authorities not doing their job properly is dead. So those, if you like, in round terms, those first 15, 16 years of progress in the system suddenly went backwards. And they're the ones that are reported and that we know of or have been profiled enough. And that doesn't include those who didn't die, who haven't been looked after properly.
But those 3 deaths also relate to recommendations that if they had been implemented 30 odd years ago, they would still be here today.
Yep.
And that is the sad thing, that all 3 of these deaths were preventable. And for me, that is where we are going backwards. We've gone backwards in relation to bail, rather than doing as Ricky Dick recommended, which was making bail address community safety, but also make it equitable. We instead have made it harder and harder and harder, which means that an Aboriginal woman who is alleged to have shoplifted ends up remanded and in prison. And situations like Veronica Nelson aren't odd. They are my everyday experience. On average, every day, I deal with 35 Aboriginal people who are arrested and remanded by Victoria Police. Many of these have committed what we call survival crimes. They are petty crimes because they are trying to survive. They don't have an income because Centrelink rules are, let's face it, all a bit ridiculous. I think most of us have faced them. We also have a housing crisis. We also have people who, because of long trauma histories, are attached to drugs of dependence and alcohol. And rather than treating those as health crises, we treat them as a justice problem. And that's where we have gone backwards.
And I think also that a lot of those reasons that you've just cited are connections to the global world as well.
Well, you've seen it in America at the moment. You've got the reversal of Roe versus Wade. Just absolutely abhorrent. You see it in the destruction of traditional lands and cultures in third world countries as well as more progressive ones. We are not alone in our struggle, that's for sure.
Any other questions from anybody here? I don't want to cut off.
You talk about the application have worked well, and then is the private. Do you think that my concept of Melbourne, there's not many that live there. So what I see is that on the territory of Central Australia, separate housing communities, two Aboriginals have to leave those places and come to the cities to do well.
No, it depends on your definition of well. That's actually a thing. So removal of people from country. Well, actually, I'll give you the extreme version of that. Up until the mid-70s, Aboriginal children on a massive scale were removed from their family, community, culture and country. They're literally stolen. That's why we're called the stolen children, the stolen generations. I'm sure people have heard of that, the stolen children. People who were removed from their family, their connection to their country, their culture and their community, and placed in homes, be it orphanages or similar state homes like that, or others who were adopted out. That did not make people better. It made them worse. It made their situation worse, their life trajectory worse. So stolen children, for example, they have worse life outcomes than the rest of the Aboriginal community. So if you think about the Australian average of welfare is there, the Aboriginal community is there, the stolen children is down here. So that people being dislocated from where they belong does not make them better unless they consciously choose to do it. But they shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to if your country, if your deep roots, if your blood is inherited from the blood of people who has always been there since the beginning of time. Remember, we're 60,000 years old at least of being on this continent. For you to have to leave is an unbearable thing. Are we not capable of bringing a better life to where those people are than saying move to the city? And I think that's how we should think about this. I think you've asked a really good question because people assume that when we talk about closing the gaps, for example, that it's built on an assumption that Aboriginal people want to be just like pejoratively white fellas, and I use that as a, just a pejorative term. But we do in one sense. Why shouldn't we have a decent standard of housing, a decent standard of healthcare? Feel that we are treated the same before the law as everyone else. Of course we should have all that, but not at the cost of giving up our culture, not at the cost of losing the very identity, the very fabric of what makes us, us. And part of that, a very big part of that, is not having to leave your country. I actually said this today. I was trying to explain welcome to country, and I said I've done it once to explain connection to country, and it was up on the Murray, up at Yarrawonga on Fold. And I did it by explaining that the river, Dungala, the Murray River, the waters through the river is like the blood in my veins. The trunks and their roots into the deep earth are like the bones of my body. The soil, the dirt, is my very muscle and sinew. And the breeze that goes through the trees and in the leaves is the air into my lungs. That's the unbroken connection. It's like where the two are as one. And so that's that giving up that culture, giving that up identity, giving that up that connection. It's a real question. I mean, the answer to it is, would Aboriginal Australians give up all that so that they could have 3-bedroom brick veneer home in the suburbs with 2.5 kids, a station wagon and a kind of flash car on the other side? Would they give that, to get all that, would they give up being who they are and where they belong? Short answer, no. So the answer to your question is, should Aboriginal people move here? No. We should take the equity we expect all Australians to have to them, the way they want it, with the expectation that they can have it in a way that suits their life and particularly does nothing to debase their very identity. Sorry, long answer.
Lovely answer. Thank you. I know there's one more question over here.
This sort of goes in a little different direction, but sort of connected. I was thinking about childhoods and written a million notes, and so thank you for what you've shared. You talked a bit about, thinking about generations and what does it mean for Aboriginal children to be Aboriginal today and into the future. And I wonder whether you might say something around the possibilities, but also the tensions of place and the digital space, because children are engaged in that digital space, and what might that afford or break down culture, place.
This one's yours because you're much more.
Yeah. For context, my uncle can't even manage an Instagram or Facebook, so he co-ops my aunts, his wife. In terms of the digital space, just to reflect on the COVID-19 period, because Teo had been in childcare through that period and started kindergarten basically online, and it did not go well because he's rooted to place and time. All he's known is being connected to country and place, and he really struggled with attending class that way, and even connecting with his great-grandfather, my pop. They've always had an in-person connection, and it felt very alien for him to try and connect with Pop that way, because usually they're at the river and Pop's telling some great big story about catching sharks in the Murray River. It's never happened, FYI, but stories. And that's how he knows things. And I think that the digital space is one it's contentious. Like COVID made us have to do it. It worked in some instances and it didn't work in others. And I think it is really dependent upon the child and how they're best kind of taught and engaged. And I think what we see, particularly through the period where we were delivering services to older Aboriginal children, being remote didn't work. That in-person connection, that being able to connect was really important. Do I think that we can use it in some aspects? Like, yes, we use it for digital education. So we put our fact sheets up there, our know your rights, an ability for them to easily report, concerns or questions. But for those more substantive matters, they rock up at our doorstep on High Street. And I don't want that to change because that's what works for them.
We're a people, we're face to face. So I agree with Nerita that the digital space is useful and it has its place, but it's particularly in relation to place or connection to country, it's no substitute for actually being there. You know, so it has a role. In COVID, we couldn't go to country. All you could do was look at it or talk to somebody who was there who'd pick up their laptop and do that and show you. But that never replaces the water of the Murray River running over my body when you go for a swim.
It's that feeling of being there, and
Yeah.
it's that feeling of our family history. Like my mum's buried on her traditional lands, as is all my family really. And for me, like that's part of, you know, my journey when I go home. It's part of my process, my ritual is that I go to Shep Cemetery, I connect there, and then I go visit my family and we touch country. So being alienated from that was probably the hardest part of COVID for me. I would do remote learning all over again, but not being able to go home to country, never.
I'm really, really sorry to even end this talk because it's absolutely been fascinating. I am, though, going to hand back over to Kylie, who's going to say a quick little thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand these to the desk.
Oh, you didn't have to do that.
Small. Thank you.
Small.
Well, no, well,
Kind of weighty.
I'll let you share. It looks very small. There's so many things that are sort of going through my mind, but what an amazing way to start the Global Childhood's Research Hub. And I keep going back to the statements of ask me who I am, let me tell you who I am. And I think about the challenge, and the hub is interdisciplinary. And so what does that mean, not just in education, but what does it mean for people in medicine, in science, in public policy, in law, in government? It's a challenge, an interdisciplinary challenge that we need to think about how we ask Aboriginal children, families, community around who they are, and not just to ask, but to actually listen ethically and respectfully. And so thank you. We really are delighted. Delighted's not the right word. It's just wonderful. And I know that it will connect to people who are here, but also people who are working with First Nations people across the globe, and the connections and the things that are different as well, that I'm sure that they will share over our journey in the hub. So thank you, and I'll pass it on to Sonia. But thank you. Thank you.